So what these calls are really about is just the kind of opportunity to jump into what's coming out, in the latest science around breathwork. Because I think me personally, I'm a very objective-minded person, and when I can see what's happening, in the clinical research and the peer-reviewed journals, it just really kind of strengthens my understanding and therefore kind of passion with sharing this with other people. And so, twice a month, we're going to jump on here and I'm just going to introduce what I find to be a really interesting paper, typically surrounding breathwork. We might jump into some other topics over time as well. But as this is a group really around kind of the education behind breathwork, we'll kind of focus on that most. And the way this will run, I'm just going to kind of give you a run through the article itself, what they did, the takeaways, and then we'll kind of finish with some practical applications. So what can we take away on a day-to-day basis, whether that's for our own practice or whether that's even sharing with other clients. So the paper I'm going to share today, I'm just going to share my screen for a moment, was a paper that was published in Nature. Nature is one of the top tier journals in the world. It's one of the most cited journals in the world. And this was a study looking at modulating heart rate oscillation and how it affects plasma amyloid beta and tau levels. If I was to translate that into, layman's language, how does breathing at a specific rate that impacts heart rate variability affect clearance of certain proteins in the brain? We're looking at this specifically through the lens of Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases. And so they wanted to look at, can breathwork be, a effective behavioral intervention that anyone can do that is going to reduce the impact of neurodegenerative disease. So what was kind of done in this study is, and firstly, it was kind of the first study that's shown that a behavioral intervention, right, i.e. not pharmaceutical, not medical management, that can reduce the risk of Alzheimer's, which I think is pretty groundbreaking. What they aimed to kind of find out was if modulating HRV or heart rate variability through a very simple breathing intervention could impact these biomarkers of Alzheimer's. So a little bit of background. It's thought, it's theorized that one of the reasons that Alzheimer's disease increases its prevalence with age is that in general, as we get older, the activity of the sympathetic nervous system increases and the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system decreases as we age. That is a kind of standard expected age-related change. The theory is that the age-related changes to the nervous system likely impact Alzheimer's, and other neurodegenerative diseases by kind of modulating how the peptides and the proteins are produced and removed in the body and the brain. And so that's a really important point. Like, what they were trying to find out was, do we slow down the production of these proteins or do we increase the clearance of these proteins? And we come to find it kind of does both. Specifically, what they looked at in this study was a few types of proteins, something called amyloid beta, which are very indicative biomarkers of Alzheimer's, and also proteins that are called tau proteins, kind of critical in the Alzheimer's risk. We see higher levels of these, higher risk of Alzheimer's. And what they're trying to discover is that increase in these proteins related to the increase in sympathetic activity and decrease in parasympathetic activity. And so what we're kind of looking at is, can breathing change the nervous system, right? And through changing the nervous system, impact the brain, and therefore impact these kind of disease processes. So what they did in this study, it was about 110 participants, I think, subdivided into an older group and a younger group. So the older group average age was about 65, and the younger group average age was about 23. So they wanted to kind of separately test, is this only effective as we age, or is it also effective in the younger brain? And what they were testing was two different interventions. So we had a breathing group, right, which did breathing as their intervention, and a non-breathing group, which just watched a video or did visualizations. So the breathing group used, in the initial kind of test, they used heart rate variability biofeedback. So it's just a little clip on the ear, it measures heart rate variability. And they tested a few different breathing rates. So they breathed 6.5 times a minute, 6 times a minute, 5.5 times a minute, 4.5 times a minute. And they saw which one of those patterns of breath induced the most oscillations or the most physiological coherence. This is something, through breathwork we call resonant frequency. We all have kind of a magic number. For the vast majority of people, it falls around 6 breaths a minute. But what they did here was they made people breathe at a few different rates, and they chose the one that, oh, that one seems to fit you best. As a side note, a big study has been done in Australia that measured when we take this biofeedback from the sensitive monitor, and we also ask the patient or the client which one of these patterns of breath felt most comfortable, 100% of time, the one that the client felt this one feels best was the one that induced the greatest, heart rate variability shifts. And so what that kind of tells us, again, independent of this study, is that our felt sense, when we say this rate, breathing at 6.5 times a minute for me feels the most comfortable compared to these other things, that's the one I should practice, right? That's the one that's going to give me the most physiological benefit. So they did that as the kind of first session. And then those in the breathing group continued with that rate of breathing for the next 4 weeks. Okay. So there wasn't any changing of breathing patterns. It was just like, here's the one that seems to work for you best. Do this for the next 4 weeks. Both groups, it was 20 to 40 minutes a day. So they either sat down and did breathing for 20, 40 minutes a day, or they just watched a screen, right? And that was visualization. It was just kind of like showing them certain things. They might have listened to music, but they weren't engaging in any breathing practices. What did they find? So they found that the breathing group, right, slow breathing at a rate of around 6 breaths a minute, reduced the levels of the amyloid beta, which is a key Alzheimer's biomarker, in both the younger and older groups, right? So this kind of suggests that slow breathing, reduces the risk of Alzheimer's is the kind of simplest way to look at that. Whether we're in an aging brain or in a young brain, it improves the ability of the brain to clear proteins out, and it also reduces the production of those said proteins. They looked at a number of different proteins and peptides, and what we saw was a significant reduction in the amyloid beta, the tau proteins. Whereas what kind of gets a little bit scary is the group that didn't do breathing actually saw an increase in these proteins. So it wasn't just kind of like, baseline, sitting and doing nothing, we saw a natural accumulation over time. So the group that didn't do breathing saw an increase. The group that did do breathing saw a decrease in these proteins. So this is the first study that shows something outside of medication can impact the production of these proteins in the brain and the clearance of these proteins in the brain, which is pretty, strong evidence to suggest, hey, we should probably go and do like a 20-minute breathing practice every day if we are concerned about brain health, or at least wanting to ensure that the healthy aging of the brain. The parts of this study that I love, right? There's no real risk factors when we're breathing at this resonant frequency. This is not a dynamic, intense form of breath work. There's not big changes in blood pressure. It doesn't have a lot of precautions or risks. Pregnant people can do this. Epileptics can do this. People with high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease can do this. That's very different to when we look at, a lot more of the conscious connected breath work or cyclic hyperventilation. We have to be a little bit more cautious. But this is kind of like applicable to all. Sit down, requires no equipment, right? We don't need the biofeedback. We just need to do some self-testing to say, this rate feels really comfortable to me. We sit down and we do it for 20 minutes. What they kind of found through the discussion in the paper was it was both a reduction in the production of the proteins and also an improvement in the clearance of the proteins. And again, what I always like to extrapolate from that, if we're improving clearance of the brain, although this study was looking at 4 very specific proteins, right? These amyloid beta and these tau proteins, how many other proteins are being impacted by this improved clearance? We could hazard a guess that a lot. This intervention was not specific to a certain type of protein. They just measured this because it's related to Alzheimer's. So we can kind of take from that and be like, okay, 20 minutes of slow breathing every day is kind of just this like washing of the brain, and it's clearing out any excess junk, right? And it's also helping rebalance that autonomic nervous system where we're seeing less of a production of these proteins. So the big takeaway for me, number one, is whether, again, this is for ourselves, it's kind of find your resonance frequency. And I'll post on the school wall that exactly how you can do that, because we start at, you can start at 7 breaths a minute, you can breathe for a minute, and you can rate that out of 10. And then you can try 6.5 breaths a minute, rate that out of 10, 6, 5, 4. And you just go through between 4 and 7 breaths a minute. And the one that feels most comfortable is your rate of resonance. From there, can I practice that 20 minutes a day? Now, I'm always of the opinion that quality over quantity and get what you can where you can. 20 minutes is a pretty lengthy practice for a lot of people, particularly those new to breath work. What this study didn't test was what happens if we did 10 minutes twice a day or 5 minutes 4 times a day, so further kind of study might need to be done there in terms of, can we get the same benefit through a different, breakdown of time? But it's pretty simple. When we just look at no equipment, sit down, breathe slowly for 20 minutes, you will promote healthy aging of the brain, and you will also reduce the likelihood of neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's being the one that we kind of measured in this study. So I'd love to, just pause there and give you both an opportunity, if you do have any questions, to throw them out, or any comments and what you think about that.
Well, that's really fascinating. I have to say, it's good to see that they're doing the research on breath work. And most of the work that I'm doing with clients is doing the conscious connected breathing, the holotropic style breathing, and that's the more intense type. But on Tuesdays, it'll be in about 3.5 hours. I'm going to be training a group that I teach every Tuesday, and we're going to be going over the resonant breathing, just for dealing with the proteins in the brain. As a personal thing, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2011, and I have been battling that since. And diet and lifestyle change has been great. Watching my mindset has been helpful. And my most recent MRI in February showed that the lesions on my brain are shrinking, and several of them have disappeared already. And so that's on my cervical spine and on my brain. And so I don't know if it is the resonant breathing that was clearing that. I know that this total load that I've been doing as far as treatment has gone and helped my condition and my brain function and my immune system and everything.
That's, firstly, I just want to say that's incredible, and like it makes me so happy when people find these more holistic, interventions alongside, medical management. But as you said, diet, lifestyle, mindset, and breathing, it's really incredible. And I'll send you a couple of extra papers, Kevin, because there are some pretty cool stuff on hypoxic intervals, right? So when we get into these longer breath holds and what that can do for stem cells, what it can do for, actual neuro regeneration, because of the body's incredible ability to adapt in light of stress, and so we induce the brain to a hypoxic state, and it goes, oh crap, I maybe need to make a little few alterations here if in case this happens again. And we see kind of neurogenesis and angiogenesis, so formation of new blood vessels. But I think that as a piece, right, of this entire puzzle that looks at health, it should be a very big piece, and it sounds like it's kind of become that in your practice.
Yeah, absolutely.